Hello! I'm Elaine, and I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter. I do ghost tours. And I am not going to tell you the stories that I tell on my tour, because you gotta pay for those. But if you want to hear some interesting things that have happened to me while I'm leading random drunk people around the French Quarter, I got you.
Sometimes people just have different reactions to certain parts of stories. And considering tour guides were almost exclusively telling horror stories, terrible things that happened in the past, some of those reactions can be a little bit extreme at times. Like sometimes you'll tell a story and people will be just weeping in the middle of your story. And the very next night you're telling the very same story with all the same information in the same tone and people are laughing. And you're just sort of like, okay. And like sometimes there are literal jokes in there that like no one will laugh at for like a week, and then the next week everybody laughs at them. But I have a couple of stories that sort of illustrate this exceptionally well. So there's one stop on the tour that I've mentioned on these stories before because, frankly, it brings out a lot of inappropriate behavior. But it's a story that involves skeletons of infants being found in a wall. And I was telling that story last week, and I look over and there's a guy whispering just loudly enough that everyone else can hear him. A really inappropriate joke about using bone as filler in mortar. And he laughs. His wife does not laugh. Nobody around him laughs. And it was just awkward. And it was one of those moments that I just talked louder in the hopes nobody would, like, remember his joke. But the very next night, I had a group at the exact same location, telling the exact same information. And I look up and, like, half of the group is crying. And I'm like, okay, usually this stop does not provoke this much emotion, but we're gonna keep going. And I finish the story, and one of the women who was like openly crying comes up to me on the walk between that stop and the next and is just chatting about this. And she was like, yeah, that hit me really hard. Like, oh my God. And she asked me, does it ever hit you when you're in the middle of a story? And I'm like, yeah, it definitely does. Sometimes I'll be telling a story and I'll just like find myself crying because I have that sudden, like, visceral emotional feeling of this was real. This happened to real people. And she was like, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. What story hit you the hardest? And I was like, the one about enslaved people being horrifically tortured to death. And she's like, oh, that's interesting. The last one with the babies was the one that really hit me. And I'm sitting here like, yeah, I know. I could see tears streaming down your face. But awkwardly, that then led her to ask me about if there are any stories that I can't tell because they're too emotional, which led me to mentioning some of the stories. Which, fun fact, if you ask me that, it gets dark. There are reasons I don't want to tell those stories. It's too emotional. But another moment of just interesting reactions. A couple of days ago, I was doing one of my tours, and the first stop on that tour is talking about voodoo. And it's not in depth. I'm not like doing a dissertation on it. It is basically like, this is the religion. This is the basic core premise. Let's move on. And in the middle of that story, one of my guests just screams out the word Santeria. And I sort of look at him and go, okay, remember comments at the end. And I start going again, and once again he interrupts to scream, Santeria! So I reiterate a second time, remember, sir, please ask all questions at the end of the story. We'll have time to talk about it then. And once again, he says, Santeria! And at that point, his wife sort of elbowed him, and I was like, okay, that will get him to be quiet, hopefully. And sure enough, I got to finish that story without him interrupting a fourth time. But as soon as I was done, I asked the group in general, questions, comments, anxieties, and he doesn't say a word. And so I looked directly at him, and like, I don't usually like calling out guests by like individuals because some people react really poorly to that. But in this case, like, I could tell he didn't mind attention, so I looked directly at him and said, sir, you had a question. And he finally said, Santeria! To which, of course, I responded, yes, sir. What about it? And he was like, well, Santeria. And I'm like, yes? And? And that's when he was finally like, is it like voodoo? And I explained that, like, yeah, they're tangentially related in that, like, they're both religions that sort of take things from different cultures and bring it all together. They're both heavily Caribbean influenced. They are both highly demonized. They both have elements about them that people consider magic, but at its core, they are very different faiths. And I finish my answer, and I sort of look at him being like, is that good? Do you want more information? And he does not say a word and just stares at me blankly. So I look at the rest of the group and go, any other questions? And then we head off to the next location. And I look up when we get to the next location, and him and his wife were sort of standing at the back chatting, and I will admit, looking a little bit irritated, but oh well. And I'm telling my story, and I see them just turn and walk away. So I'm guessing they did not like my answer for whatever reason. But the good news is I got reassurance that I wasn't being rude or anything, because between that stop and the next, one of the other guests came up to me and was like, why was that guy just shouting Santeria? And I was like, I don't know. But the good news is I now have the Sublime song stuck in my head. And she was like, yeah, me too. So strange. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and be sure to check out my book, Drunks of the French Quarter Theater, available on Amazon, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, pretty much wherever.